I did not return because I wanted to. I returned because there were no other places left where I could hide. The road ended without warning, as if the world itself had decided that everything beyond this point had to be faced on foot. The asphalt vanished, replaced by jagged stones, damp earth, and a wind heavy with salt that struck my face with deliberate cruelty. Every step demanded effort, and with each one, something inside my chest tightened, as though my body remembered what my mind had spent decades refusing to acknowledge. The lighthouse did not appear immediately. I sensed it before I saw it. The feeling was strange and intimate, like a presence leaning over me long before my eyes could confirm it. When it finally emerged through the mist, it looked smaller than it had in memory, yet far more threatening. Time had peeled away its dignity, leaving rust, cracks, and discoloration like exposed bone. It stood alone against the gray sky, enduring, waiting, patient in a way only structures that have outlived their purpose can be. I stopped several yards away, my breath shallow, my hands stiff inside my coat. The sound of the sea below was constant, relentless, a low roar that never fully rose or fell, like breathing that belonged to something too large to see. The smell of salt and decay filled my lungs, and with it came a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the climb. This place had a way of reaching inside me without asking permission. The door resisted when I pushed it. Rust groaned, metal protested, and for a moment I wondered if it would refuse me entirely. When it finally gave way, the sound echoed too loudly in the hollow interior, ricocheting upward through the spiral stairwell. Dust stirred in the stale air, floating like ash in the dim light. I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped immediately, wrapping around me with the familiarity of something remembered rather than felt. The first step creaked beneath my weight, then the second, then the third. I moved carefully, testing each one before committing myself, aware of how easily old structures collapse when asked to carry something they were never meant to bear again. My hand brushed the wall as I climbed, fingers grazing flaking paint and damp stone. The texture was wrong in a way I could not fully explain, too rough, too alive. As I ascended, the sound of the wind outside faded, replaced by the slow, uneven rhythm of my breathing and the soft thud of my boots. Each turn of the stairwell felt like a descent rather than a climb, as though I were being drawn inward instead of upward. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing against my chest. I told myself it was only age, only fatigue, only the climb. I did not believe it. At the first landing, I stopped. A small maintenance room opened off to the side, its door hanging crookedly from swollen hinges. Inside, shadows pooled in the corners, refusing to be fully claimed by the weak light filtering through a cracked window. Old tools lay scattered across a table, their handles worn smooth by hands long gone. I recognized them instantly, not by sight, but by the sudden ache in my wrists, by the way my fingers curled involuntarily as if reaching for something familiar. I should not have recognized them. I had convinced myself of that for years. A coil of rope lay on the floor, stiff and brittle with age. Rusted hooks clung to the wall, their tips dulled but still sharp enough to draw blood. The sight of them sent a sharp, inexplicable chill through me, and I stepped back without realizing I had moved. My pulse hammered in my ears. The room felt crowded, oppressive, as though it were holding its breath. I left it quickly, drawn upward by a need I could not name. The higher I climbed, the more disoriented I became. Time stretched and warped inside the lighthouse. Minutes felt like hours. Memories brushed against the edges of my awareness without fully revealing themselves, like shapes moving beneath dark water. I caught flashes of sensation rather than images, the sting of cold against bare skin, the burn of salt in my throat, the weight of something heavier than it should have been. At the next level, I found the logbook. It lay on a narrow shelf, exactly where it had always been. The cover was warped,
its edges swollen and cracked, but the spine remained intact. Dust coated its surface in a thin, even layer, undisturbed. I stared at it for a long time before touching it, my hand hovering inches above, as though the space between us were charged. The rational part of me insisted it was impossible for it to still be there, untouched, after all these years. Another part, quieter but far more certain, knew it could never have been anywhere else. When I finally lifted it, the weight surprised me. It was heavier than paper should be, heavy with accumulation, with repetition, with days recorded and forgotten. I did not open it. I did not need to. The contents pressed against my mind anyway, page after page of routine observations, of weather patterns, of maintenance notes, all circling around a central absence. What was not written mattered more than what was. I set it back down carefully, as though returning it to a grave. Further up, the staircase narrowed. The walls closed in, their curves tighter, the ceiling lower. My shoulders brushed the stone now, and each contact sent a small jolt through my body. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck despite the cold. I became acutely aware of my age, of the stiffness in my knees, of the faint tremor in my hands. This place demanded more than memory. It demanded endurance. Near the top, something stopped me. A shape lay across the steps, partially obscured by shadow. At first I thought it was debris, fallen stone or collapsed wood. As I approached, my stomach twisted. It was an object I had not seen since the day I left, an object that should not have survived the years of neglect and exposure. It rested there as if deliberately placed, waiting for me to notice it, waiting for me to remember. I stood frozen, my foot hovering above the step, my breath caught between inhale and exhale. The lighthouse seemed to lean inward, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening until it was difficult to draw into my lungs. My heart pounded with a violence that felt almost external, as though it were escaping my chest entirely. I knew then that I had not come here to retrieve anything. I had come here to confront what I had buried. And the lighthouse, patient and unyielding, was ready to make sure I did.
I did not step over the object immediately. My body refused the command, even as my mind urged it forward. It lay across the narrow steps like a deliberate obstruction, small enough to be dismissed as debris, yet heavy with meaning. Time had not erased it, salt had not consumed it. It remained stubbornly present, preserved by the same force that had preserved everything else here. Neglect mixed with intention. The closer I moved, the clearer its shape became. A weathered lantern, its glass clouded but unbroken, its metal frame corroded into sharp, uneven edges. My fingers tingled as if anticipating contact. I remembered its weight, the way it pulled at the arm after hours of carrying it, the way its faint glow never truly cut through the darkness, but merely revealed how vast the shadows were. Seeing it again made my throat tighten, and for a moment the stairwell tilted, forcing me to brace myself against the wall. I bent down and lifted it. The metal was cold, colder than the surrounding air, leaching warmth from my skin instantly. Dust smeared across my palm, mixing with sweat, leaving behind a gray film that felt accusatory. Holding it unlocked something that had been sealed too tightly for too long. Not a memory in the usual sense, but a sequence of physical reactions. Shallow breathing, clenched jaw, the subtle tremor that began in my wrist and spread upward. I set the lantern aside and continued climbing, slower now, every movement measured. The higher levels of the lighthouse were darker, the windows narrower, the light more reluctant to enter. Moisture clung to the stone walls, and the air carried a sour, stagnant odor that suggested years of isolation layered one upon another. My footsteps echoed differently here, duller, absorbed rather than reflected, as if the structure itself were listening. Another room opened onto the stairwell, its door completely gone, leaving only a jagged frame. This space had once served as a sleeping quarters,
A rusted bed frame leaned against the wall, its springs exposed like ribs. A thin mattress lay slumped across it, stained and collapsed inward, bearing the permanent imprint of a body that had once rested there night after night. The sight of it struck me harder than I expected. I remembered the exhaustion that drove me into that bed, the way sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the ceaseless roar of the sea and the persistent sense of being watched. I stepped inside despite the instinct telling me to keep moving. My boots sank slightly into the warped floorboards. A small table stood near the wall, one leg shorter than the others, forcing it to lean at an angle. On its surface lay nothing but dust and the faint outline of where something had once been placed and removed repeatedly. I traced the shape with my eyes, and the absence screamed louder than any presence could have. The walls were covered in faint marks, shallow grooves scratched into the paint. At first glance, they appeared random, the result of years of neglect. When I looked closer, a pattern emerged. Vertical lines grouped together, interrupted at irregular intervals. Counting marks. Days. Nights. Time measured in desperation rather than hours. My chest tightened as the realization settled. I had done this. My hand had done this. Each mark represented endurance stretched to its limit. The memory tried to surface fully then, pressing against the fragile barrier I had constructed to keep it submerged. I felt it in flashes, the isolation, the crushing monotony, the growing certainty that something was wrong. Not with the lighthouse, not with the sea, but with me, with the way my thoughts had begun to loop, the way fear had crept in without a clear origin, feeding on silence and darkness. I left the room abruptly, drawn upward by a need bordering on panic. The lantern room was close now. I could feel it in the subtle change in air pressure, in the way the structure vibrated faintly beneath my feet. My breath came faster, harsher, each inhale scraping against my throat. I wondered briefly whether my body would give out before I reached the top, whether this place would claim something more from me before I was ready to surrender it. At the final landing, I paused. The door to the lantern room stood ajar, its glass panels opaque with grime and salt. Light seeped through in thin, uneven bands, painting the stairwell in sickly shades of gray. I hesitated, my hand hovering inches beneath the doorframe. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I closed my eyes, steadying myself against the wall. When I opened them again, the past pressed closer than ever. I stepped inside. The lantern room was larger than I remembered, or perhaps emptier. The massive lens dominated the center, its glass surfaces dulled but intact, catching what little light entered and fracturing it into distorted reflections. The mechanism beneath it sat frozen, gears locked in a state of permanent inactivity. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to preserve footprints that did not belong to me. My heart hammered as I followed those prints with my eyes. They circled the room, uneven, erratic, converging near the railing that overlooked the sea far below. The railing itself was corroded, its metal pitted and flaking. One section leaned outward at a subtle angle, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. I approached it slowly. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a vast, shifting expanse of dark water capped with white foam. Waves crashed against the rocks below in a relentless rhythm that vibrated up through the lighthouse and into my bones. Watching it stirred a deep, familiar dread. I remembered standing here before, staring down into that churning void, feeling the pull of it like a living thing. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, distorted and fractured by grime and curvature. The face looking back was older, lined, hollowed out by years of avoidance. Yet beneath that, I saw the same eyes, carrying the same fear, the same guilt. My gaze dropped to the floor near the railing. There, partially hidden beneath a layer of dust and debris, lay something I had convinced myself never existed, a shape unmistakable in its outline. The air left my lungs in a silent rush, and my knees weakened as recognition hit with full force. This was not a memory triggered. This was evidence preserved. The lighthouse had not forgotten. And it seemed neither had I.
I stood over the object for a long time without bending down. My body seemed to understand before my mind allowed it. The shape on the floor was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with decay. It did not belong to the slow, patient erosion that claimed everything else in the lighthouse. It belonged to a moment, a single instant that had refused to dissolve into the past. The dust around it was thinner, disturbed. My own footprints overlapped older ones, but beneath both were marks that time had tried and failed to erase. I lowered myself carefully, my joints protesting, and brushed the surface with the back of my hand. The dust lifted easily, revealing darkened metal beneath, cold, unforgiving, familiar. A key. Not just any key, the lighthouse master key. The one that opened every door, every sealed space, every place meant to remain inaccessible unless absolutely necessary. I had carried it on my belt for years. I had felt its weight shift as I moved, heard its faint metallic tap against bone and fabric. Losing it had not been an accident. Finding it here was not coincidence. My fingers closed around it, and the room seemed to tilt. The sea beyond the glass surged higher, louder, its rhythm accelerating until it matched the pounding in my chest. Images rose unbidden now, no longer content to lurk at the edges. They came in fragments, sharp and unfiltered. A storm. Not the kind that announces itself gradually, but the sudden, violent kind that arrives as if summoned by something darker. Wind screaming through the structure, the lighthouse shuddering under the assault. My hands raw and shaking, my thoughts scattered, stretched thin by days without proper sleep. The logbook entries growing sloppier, less precise, time blurring, the sense of isolation deepening into something poisonous. I remembered the other presence then, the thing I had labeled incorrectly for years. I had told myself it was paranoia, exhaustion, the mind turning against itself in prolonged solitude. But standing here now, holding the key, I knew that explanation had been incomplete. Something had changed during that storm. Something had crossed a threshold. The footprints circling the room no longer seemed random. They traced a pattern of agitation, of indecision. They stopped abruptly near the railing, then resumed again farther back, as though someone had approached the edge and retreated more than once. I followed them slowly, each step heavy with implication. Near the base of the lens, I noticed scratches etched into the metal housing, not the shallow, repetitive marks of counting time, but deep, erratic gouges. The metal had resisted, but the force applied had been relentless, desperate. I ran my fingers along the edges of the scratches and felt a sharp sting as one caught my skin. Blood welled quickly, bright against the dull gray. The sight grounded me in the present, even as the past threatened to consume everything. I pressed my thumb against the cut until the bleeding slowed, then turned my attention back to the room. Something else was wrong, something subtle. The air carried a faint sour note beneath the salt and dust. It reminded me of iron and damp fabric, of confined spaces that had not been opened in a long time. My gaze drifted to the far wall, where a narrow door stood partially concealed behind the lens mechanism. I had not noticed it at first, obscured as it was by shadow and neglect. The door was different from the others, thicker, reinforced. Its surface bore marks of repeated impact, shallow dents clustered around the handle and lock. My breath shortened. I remembered this door now, not clearly, but enough. It led to a storage compartment carved into the stone, originally intended for emergency supplies. Somewhere along the way, it had taken a different purpose, a purpose I did not want to examine too closely.
The key felt heavier in my hand as I approached. Each step sent a jolt of resistance through my body, as though some instinct older than reason was urging me to turn back. I ignored it. Avoidance had brought me here. It would not save me now. The lock resisted when I inserted the key, stiff with corrosion. I applied gentle pressure at first, then more force, my wrist straining as metal protested against metal. The sound echoed too loudly in the lantern room, reverberating through the glass and stone. When the lock finally gave, the sensation traveled up my arm like a shock. I pulled the door open. The smell hit me immediately, thick and unmistakable despite the years that had passed. The air inside the compartment was stale, trapped, heavy with decay. Light spilled in weakly, revealing a narrow space barely large enough to stand in. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty now, their contents long since consumed or removed. Something lay on the floor. At first my mind refused to assign it a shape. It remained an abstraction, a cluster of lines and shadows that did not resolve in meaning. I stepped closer, my heart hammering so violently it blurred my vision. The object resolved, gradually, mercilessly. Clothing. Weathered, darkened, stiff with age. Fabric torn in places, edges frayed. I recognized the pattern instantly, recognition blooming with a sickening certainty. It was not mine. It never had been mine. I knew that even then. My knees buckled, and I caught myself against the doorframe, breath tearing in and out of my lungs. The compartment seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing inward, the ceiling lowering. My thoughts fractured, splintering into jagged pieces that refused to align. The storm memory surged back with brutal clarity now. The way the lighthouse had trembled, the way the sea had raged, the way fear had twisted into something darker, more selfish, the way survival had narrowed my focus until there was no room left for mercy. I remembered hands, not clearly, just the sensation of resistance, weight, the panic that followed when control slipped, the certainty, sudden and irreversible, that something had gone terribly wrong. I staggered backward, away from the compartment, the door swinging wider behind me. My foot struck something solid on the floor of the lantern room, and I nearly fell. Looking down, I saw it clearly for the first time. A long, rusted chain, one end bolted to the floor, the other lying loose and empty. The room spun. The lighthouse groaned around me, a low, resonant sound that felt almost like a response. The sea below roared louder, as if drawn to the truth finally surfacing. My chest burned with the effort of breathing, each inhale shallow and unsatisfying. I had come here to confront a memory. What I had found was a crime, and I was running out of places to hide from it.
The chain lay motionless at my feet, yet it felt alive in a way nothing else in the lighthouse did. Its rusted links were thick, industrial, meant to restrain something strong, something unwilling. I followed its length with my eyes, tracing it back to the bolt embedded deep in the stone floor. The bolt had been driven with care, precision, intention. This had not been a temporary solution. This had been preparation. My mind resisted the conclusion even as the evidence assembled itself piece by piece. I had survived for decades by keeping these fragments separated, refusing to let them touch, let alone align. Standing here now, surrounded by proof that outlasted my denial, I felt the fragile architecture of that defense begin to crumble. I moved away from the chain, my steps unsteady, and leaned against the wall beneath one of the grimy windows. Cold glass pressed against my back. The sea beyond surged and retreated, its vast indifference a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside me. I closed my eyes, but darkness offered no refuge. Images pressed in from every direction, overlapping, refusing order. I remembered the day it began, though at the time it had not felt like a beginning, just another shift, just another stretch of isolation. Supplies had been late. The weather had been worsening for days. The radio had crackled with static more often than clarity. Each night had stretched longer than the last, sleep coming in short, fractured bursts that left me more exhausted than rested. Then the storm arrived. Not gradually, not with warning, it descended with sudden violence. Wind howling like something enraged, waves slamming against the rocks with enough force to send vibrations up through the lighthouse and into my bones. The structure groaned under the assault, every sound amplified in the confined space. I remembered gripping the railing, knuckles white, convinced for a moment that the tower itself might give way. That was when I had noticed the light in the distance. At first, I had assumed it was a trick of exhaustion, a reflection, a misfiring neuron desperate for stimulation. But it persisted, erratic and weak, rising and falling with the swell of the sea. A small vessel, caught too close to the rocks, fighting a losing battle against the storm. I remembered the surge of something that had cut through the fog in my mind then. Purpose, urgency. The lighthouse existed for moments like this. The mechanism had failed. I remembered discovering it with a sense of disbelief that bordered on panic. A critical component worn beyond tolerance, finally giving out under strain. The beam that should have guided the vessel away from danger had sputtered and died, leaving only darkness and the relentless storm. I had worked frantically, hands shaking, tools slipping, the wind screaming through every crack and seam, but the damage was too severe. I remembered watching from the lantern room as the vessel vanished from sight, swallowed by waves and mist. The feeling that followed was not grief. Not yet. It was dread. The understanding that something irreversible had occurred. I told myself there was nothing more I could do. The memory shifted then, sharpening, dragging me forward. I remembered the shape on the rocks below, barely visible between surging waves. A figure clinging to stone, rising and falling with the water, movements desperate and uncoordinated. Survival reduced to instinct. I had felt a jolt of disbelief, followed by something colder, something calculating. The storm had not claimed everyone. I remembered the descent, the stairs slick with moisture, my boots slipping, my heart hammering with exertion and fear. The door at the base of the lighthouse resisting before finally yielding to force. The wind nearly tearing it from my grasp as I stepped out onto the rocks, the spray of the sea stinging my eyes, my mouth filling with salt. I remembered reaching the figure. The details were blurred by time, but the sensations remained sharp. The weight of a soaked body. The way muscles had strained as I pulled. The frantic resistance born of terror but not intent. Hands clutching at me, at the chain I carried, at anything solid. I remembered the moment when fear tipped into panic, when control slipped and instinct took over. I remembered the choice. It had not felt like a choice then. It felt like necessity, survival. The storm was worsening. The rocks were slick. The waves rose higher, each one threatening to tear us both away. I told myself that if I did not act decisively, neither of us would survive, that hesitation would be fatal. I remembered securing the chain. The weight of it had seemed reassuring at the time, solid, certain. I had dragged the figure back towards the lighthouse, every movement a battle against wind and water. Inside, the storm's roar was muted but not silenced. The confined space amplified every breath, every movement, every sign of distress. I remembered the storage compartment. The decision to use it came quickly, almost automatically. A place of shelter, protection, containment. I told myself it was temporary, that once the storm passed, once help arrived, everything would be made right. I closed the door and secured the lock with shaking hands, my heart racing, my thoughts a chaotic blur of justification. I remembered retreating upward, telling myself I needed to restore the light, that others might still be out there, that my duty was not finished. I did not remember going back down. Standing in the lantern room now, with the chain at my feet and the key heavy in my hand,
The absence of that memory screamed louder than anything else. I knew what it meant. I knew what that gap concealed. The mind does not erase without reason. My gaze drifted back towards the open compartment door. Darkness pooled within it, thick and impenetrable, as though the years had condensed into something almost physical. The smell lingered still, clinging to the air, impossible to ignore. The evidence of time's passage lay scattered across the floor in fragments of fabric and rust. The storm had ended eventually. They always do. The sea calms, the wind retreats, and when silence returns, it brings clarity that cannot be outrun. I left the lighthouse not long after that. I told myself it was reassignment, burnout, a need for change. I did not return. I did not speak of what happened. Official reports were filed, incidents explained. The world moved on. But this place had waited. The lighthouse had held on to everything I abandoned. The key, the chain, the room, the truth. My legs felt weak as I took a step towards the compartment. Each movement felt deliberate, monumental, as though I were wading through something dense and resistant. The air seemed to thicken with every inch I closed, pressing against my chest, my throat, my thoughts. I reached the threshold and stopped. Inside, beyond the scattered remnants, something else caught my eye. Something partially obscured beneath debris, its shape unfamiliar, yet unsettling. I leaned closer, squinting against the dim light. It was smaller than I had expected, smaller than the memory I had allowed myself to construct. My breath hitched as the implications settled, cold and absolute. The lighthouse groaned again, the sound deep and resonant, and the floor vibrated beneath my feet. Outside, the sea surged higher, waves crashing with renewed fury, as if responding to the moment. I realized then that confronting the past was not the final step. Accepting responsibility was, and I had not yet reached the worst of it.
I felt the weight of the key in my hand like it carried more than metal. Each link of the chain on the floor seemed to hum with memory, vibrating faintly, as if alive, as if aware of my presence and judgment. The lantern room had become a prison of thought, the walls pressing inward with every heartbeat. My legs ached, knees trembling, but I could not move away. I had come too far to turn back now. The compartment door beckoned. Shadows pooled inside it like water, dark and thick. The fabric on the floor was not just old clothing, it was evidence of choices that could never be undone. My mind raced through every calculation I had avoided for decades. Every rationalization collapsed under the weight of certainty. I remembered the storm, the sea, the chain, and the compartment, all in a sudden, overwhelming clarity. I had trapped someone, a life held in that small, suffocating space, and I had walked away. I had left the storm to finish the work I began, convinced it would absolve me, convinced that survival justified everything. I leaned against the railing, staring through the grimy glass at the dark water below. The ocean roared with indifference, yet it seemed to echo my guilt back to me, relentless and unyielding. I could feel it crawling over my skin, in the sweat that cooled unevenly, in the tension coiling along my spine. My memory no longer whispered, it screamed. Every step I had taken since that day had been haunted, measured in the rhythm of avoidance. I had survived, yes, but survival had become a chain as heavy as the one I carried now. I stepped forward again, drawn by the inevitability of what awaited in the compartment. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, protesting my slow, deliberate approach. My hands trembled as I reached toward the edge, toward the darkness, toward the truth that I had fought to keep hidden. Dust swirled in the stale air, caught in the faint light that filtered through the glass, making the shadows shift unnaturally. My breath caught. Every sound, every creak, every moan of the structure was magnified, seeming to track my heartbeat. I crouched, peering into the compartment.
The chain gleamed faintly where it rested against the floor, its rusted metal a stark reminder of permanence. The fabric lay in tangled heaps, each fold a testament to what I had done. I forced myself closer, compelled by the gnawing need to face it, to measure the scale of my guilt. The air was thick, almost solid, pressing into my lungs with every inhale. My vision narrowed. The room contracted until all I could see was the chain, the fabric, and the faint, dark stain that time could not erase. I stumbled backwards, my back hitting the railing. My knees buckled beneath me. The lighthouse groaned. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the scent of salt and storm and decay. The sea seemed impossibly distant and impossibly close at once. I realized then that I could never leave this place the same way I had arrived. The evidence of my past would not allow it. It would not let me breathe. It would not let me forget. The lantern in the corner of the room caught my eye. Its glass, dull but intact, reflected the faint light, fracturing it into 1,000 shards across the walls. I moved toward it instinctively, each step deliberate, a silent negotiation with the fear coiling in my stomach. I lifted it, dust spilling across my palms, and felt a wave of vertigo. The reflection showed a face older than I remembered, eyes hollowed by years of avoidance. Yet beneath the age, beneath the weariness, I recognized the same man who had made that terrible choice, who had walked away and left another to fate. I set the lantern down with a tremor and turned back to the compartment. The chain seemed to pulse, almost as if urging me closer. The evidence of the past pressed at me, demanding acknowledgement. I had survived storms, decades, silence, but now survival meant nothing without reckoning. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, yet the logic of guilt was stronger than fear. I could not escape what I had created, what I had abandoned. It was here. It had waited. The lantern room shivered as if responding to my tension. The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the glass. My heart raced in rhythm with the sea, relentless and unyielding. The compartment door loomed before me, shadows curling from it like smoke. I realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. Confronting the compartment meant confronting myself. All that I had feared, all that I had hidden, was concentrated in that narrow, suffocating space. I could step forward and see it, or step back and let the past continue to dictate my existence. There was no middle ground. I did not move. My hand hovered over the edge of the doorframe, hovering between action and paralysis. The weight of the key burned in my palm. The chain lay at my feet, heavy and patient. The lantern cast fractured light across the room. The sea roared, the lighthouse groaned, and I understood with an unbearable clarity that the decision I made next would define the remainder of my life, whether I survived it physically or not. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I was ready. I pressed my hand against the edge of the compartment and hesitated, heart hammering, sweat cold against my skin. The darkness inside seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as though it had waited for decades just for this moment. I could feel the weight of every choice, every omission, pressing down on me, constricting my chest like a vice. I had come seeking truth, but truth was heavier than I had imagined. It was not just an idea, a memory. It was physical, tangible, unavoidable. The chain at my feet gleamed faintly, catching what little light remained in the lantern room. Each link was a reminder of control, of restraint, of decisions made in panic and fear. I remembered the storm, the vessel, the hands that clutched at me. The compartment had been a temporary solution, or so I had told myself, but temporary had stretched into permanence, and permanence had morphed into a haunting. My breath quickened, shallow and uneven, as my mind filled with every detail I had tried to bury. The weight of guilt pressed into my skull, leaving no room for denial. I crouched and peered into the compartment. The tangle of fabric, the faint stain that time had failed to erase, the chain's loose end, each detail screamed accusation. My fingers twitched, wanting to reach in, to touch, to confirm. Confirmation was a double-edged blade. It promised clarity, but demanded confrontation. I forced myself to stand, hands gripping the railing, feeling the metal bite into my palms. The sea beyond the glass thundered in response, relentless and impartial. Time stretched. I could feel the minutes dripping like water from a cracked pipe, each one heavier than the last. My mind replayed the storm in fragments, wind screaming through cracks, waves lashing against rocks, my body slick with cold and salt. The moment when survival had overridden morality, when instinct had become dominance, returned with unbearable vividness. I had done what I thought necessary, and yet the consequences were far greater than I allowed myself to imagine. I had trapped more than flesh and bone. I had trapped myself in guilt. I lifted the lantern again, its light fractured across the room. Shadows danced along the walls, warped and distorted, echoing shapes that might have been memories or might have been visions. Every corner seemed to shift as I moved, the lighthouse itself alive in its response to my presence. I traced the chain with my eyes, following its curve back to the floorbolt. Each link seemed to hum with anticipation, with knowledge. The key burned in my hand, a reminder of access, of authority, of responsibility. I could undo the lock, confront what I had avoided for decades, or I could walk away. But walking away was no longer an option. I moved closer. Each step was a battle against instinct, against fear. My legs trembled, joints screaming, but something deeper propelled me forward. The compartment loomed, shadows curling from within. The fabric on the floor seemed to shift slightly, as though aware of my gaze. Dust motes floated lazily, catching the light and forming tiny specters that danced around the edges of perception. The air smelled of salt, iron, and decay, a combination that pressed heavily on my chest. I knelt and extended a hand into the darkness. The compartment yielded to my touch, the chain brushing my fingers, the fabric stiff and unyielding. The moment stretched into eternity. I could feel the silence surrounding me, thick and suffocating, each heartbeat echoing like a drum. And then, as if in response to my hesitation, the room shivered. The lantern flickered. Outside, the sea slammed against the rocks with renewed ferocity. The lighthouse itself groaned, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated in my bones. I withdrew my hand, trembling, and pressed my forehead against the railing. I had come seeking answers. I had come seeking absolution. But there is no absolution in truth, only recognition. The compartment held nothing new. It held only the consequences I created, and the knowledge that I could no longer escape them. I stepped back, breathing unevenly, and allowed myself a long moment to stare through the lantern room windows. The sea stretched endlessly, indifferent and brutal. The wind howled, rattling glass and stone. I realized that survival had never been enough. Survival had been hollow. Only confrontation, only acknowledgement could offer a path forward. The choice lay before me. The compartment waited. The chain waited. The key burned in my hand. And I understood that the next step would define me entirely, not as a survivor, not as a witness,
but as a man who finally faced the truth of his own making.
I gripped the key tighter, knuckles whitening as the lantern cast fractured light across the room. The chain lay coiled like a sleeping snake, inert yet threatening. My chest ached, lungs burning with every shallow breath. The silence pressed in, suffocating, broken only by the distant roar of the sea. I could feel the weight of decades bearing down on me, the accumulation of every moment I had chosen avoidance, every decision I had justified. They pressed into my mind, demanding action, demanding acknowledgement. I stepped toward the compartment again. Each movement felt deliberate, monumental, as if the lighthouse itself demanded that I move precisely, measure by measure. My boots scuffed against the wooden floor, echoing in the space, mingling with the hum of distant waves. The compartment seemed smaller as I approached, shadows thickening at its edges, concealing corners I could not fully see. Dust shifted faintly with the motion of air, forming tiny specters that danced just out of clarity, teasing memory and reality. I knelt, resting one hand on the cold floor, feeling the grooves of the stone beneath my palm. The chain brushed my fingers. Rust flakes crumbled under light pressure, sprinkling the air like burnt paper. I remembered the first time I had touched it in desperation under the storm, sweat and rain clinging to my body. The memory pressed against me now with unbearable vividness. The terror, the exertion, the inevitability. I had done what I had done to survive, but the cost was beyond calculation. The fabric stirred faintly in the corner of my eye. A shadow, or my imagination. Either way, it reacted to my presence, as if aware of my scrutiny. I inhaled sharply, sweat prickling along my spine. Every instinct urged retreat. Survival demanded flight. But this was no longer about survival. This was about facing what I had created, what I had left behind, what had been waiting silently all these years. I reached into the compartment. The chain resisted slightly, its weight heavier than memory recalled. The fabric pressed against my fingers, stiff and dry. A faint metallic scent rose from the space, mingling with the salt and decay in the air. My heart thundered. I could feel the full measure of my guilt, my fear, condensed into that small, suffocating space. And I understood that this confrontation would not end quietly. I pulled the chain free, letting it fall loosely across the floor. My breath shuddered in my chest. The lantern flickered again, casting the room into alternating light and shadow. Time seemed to stretch, elongate. The lighthouse shivered under the force of the wind outside. The sea bellowed, waves slamming against the rocks in a rhythm that mirrored the hammering of my heart. Everything converged into one point. Choice, action, redemption, or collapse. I forced myself to stand, dragging the chain with me. The lantern's fractured light revealed every corner of the room, every stain, every shadow, every echo of the past. The key burned in my palm, a tangible reminder of access, of responsibility, of accountability. I could undo the lock. I could face the consequences. I could finally acknowledge the weight I had carried silently for decades. Or I could step back and remain in the hollowed refuge of avoidance, as I had done for so long. But avoidance was gone. It had no place here. The compartment door loomed, dark and patient. I pressed forward, muscles tense, every nerve alert. The chain scraped across the floor, metal biting against wood. Dust swirled around my boots. My hands shook, but the decision had settled in my mind, heavy and immovable. I would open the door fully. I would face what had been hidden. I would confront myself as much as the truth. I placed the key in the lock, hearing the click resonate through the room.
The door resisted for a heartbeat, then gave. The darkness inside seemed to inhale, drawing me closer. I hesitated only for a second, long enough to realize that the storm I had survived outside was nothing compared to the tempest awaiting within. I pushed the door. The room revealed itself in a narrow beam of light, dust motes dancing across the air. The chain coiled at my feet, the fabric stiff and unyielding. And then I saw it, the evidence of decades, of my choices, of the life I had condemned to silence. The truth sat there quietly, impossibly still, as though expecting me. And I understood, fully and irrevocably, that the moment of reckoning had arrived.
The compartment swallowed the light from the lantern, leaving shadows thicker than memory. I stepped closer, the chain dragging against the floor with a metallic whisper. My fingers grazed the fabric, stiff, brittle, impregnated with decades of neglect and fear. The scent was sharp, iron and decay, but beneath it, faintly, there was something else. The residue of human endurance, of life clinging to impossible circumstances. I realized then that this was not just a relic, this was survival, waiting for acknowledgement. I pulled the fabric aside and saw what I had feared. Not a person, time had claimed that, but traces of presence, makeshift bedding, rusted remnants of provisions, scratches in the wood where life had protested against confinement. Every detail screamed at me, the choices I had made, the shortcuts I had taken, the moments of self-preservation that had overridden morality. My chest tightened. I had thought I had escaped the consequences, had hidden them behind distance and denial, but they had waited patiently, demanding recognition. I crouched, tracing the scratches with trembling fingers. Each one was a marker of time, a testament to endurance, a silent accusation. I could not undo it. I could not bring back what had been lost, but I could bear witness. And for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of responsibility. The chain, once a tool of containment, now felt like a tether connecting me to truth, pulling me back from the edge of denial. I straightened, breathing unevenly. The lantern light fractured across the walls, illuminating every corner, every shadow, every imperfection. The lighthouse groaned, the wind outside wailing like a chorus of judgment. And yet, amidst the cacophony, I felt something I had not felt in years. Clarity. The recognition that acknowledgement, however painful, was a form of release. The past could not be undone, but it could be faced. And facing it, in its own way, was survival of a higher order. I left the compartment, dragging the chain behind me. Each step echoed through the lighthouse, each footfall a reminder of the journey I had taken, not just up the stairs, not just into the room, but into myself. The lantern's fractured light danced across the walls as if celebrating and condemning simultaneously. Outside, the sea had calmed, the storm finally spent, leaving only the rhythm of waves against rocks. Life continued, indifferent, yet persistent. I set the chain down and leaned against the railing. The lighthouse no longer seemed menacing. It seemed patient. It had waited decades for me to return, not to punish, but to demand reckoning. I realized that my life had been shaped entirely by avoidance. I had fled responsibility, fled consequences, fled my own conscience. And yet the lighthouse had endured, reminding me that time alone could not erase truth. I let my gaze drift outward,
over the dark water, over the horizon blurred by salt and mist. I understood that the moment I had dreaded, the moment of confrontation, was also a moment of liberation. The acknowledgement of guilt, the facing of the consequences, was not a burden, but a bridge. The chain, the compartment, the relics of despair, they were no longer symbols of condemnation. They were reminders that survival required more than instinct. It required courage, honesty, and the willingness to see oneself fully. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of the waves, the wind brushing against the glass. For the first time in decades, I allowed a sliver of hope to enter, a possibility that I could live with the choices I had made, that I could continue beyond them. The storm had passed, the sea had calmed, and so could I. I stepped outside onto the balcony of the lantern room. The wind was cold but cleansing, whipping against my face, tearing away the residue of years spent hiding from truth. The sea stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent, but beautiful in its constancy. I took a deep breath and felt the tightness in my chest loosen, the tension in my legs ease. I had confronted what I had avoided for decades. I had faced the consequences of my actions. I had acknowledged the past. The lighthouse no longer loomed as a threat. It was a witness, a guide, a monument to endurance, not mine alone, but to the passage of time and the resilience of human conscience. I realized that survival was not merely escaping death or danger. Survival was the courage to face oneself fully and unflinchingly, and to carry forward with the weight of experience, transformed into wisdom. I looked at the chain lying on the balcony floor, the key still warm in my hand, the lantern casting fractured light across the stone. I understood, finally, that the past would always be part of me, but it did not have to define me. I could step forward, not in fear, not in avoidance, but in recognition and acceptance. I let the lantern light spill outward, illuminating the edges of the balcony, the horizon, the waves below. I inhaled deeply, the wind and salt filling my lungs, carrying away years of guilt and hesitation. For the first time, I felt something I had thought impossible: freedom. And with that freedom came peace. The lighthouse stood behind me, patient, enduring. I walked forward, away from the shadows, towards a world that waited to see what I had become. The storm had ended, the sea had calmed, and I, finally, had returned to life.